All right, let's dive in. Today we're tackling a big one, the patterns and cycles that have shaped America, and what those patterns might tell us about where we're headed next.
Sounds ambitious.
It is, but we've got a great guide. We're taking a deep dive into George Friedman's The Storm Before the Calm. He lays out some really interesting historical insights and predictions.
It's fascinating stuff. You know, one of the things that really struck me is Friedman's idea that American history isn't just a straight line. It's more like a series of cycles.
Like a rhythm.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, it's interesting. Friedman points out that America is, from its very beginning, an invented nation.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about it. The United States was literally founded by people who were, they wanted a fresh start. They were escaping old systems, old ways of thinking.
Breaking free from those constraints.
Exactly. So that spirit of reinvention, it's like baked into the country's DNA.
And it's not just about starting over, it's about actively shaping a new order, a new reality.
Right. And Friedman uses a really interesting example of this. He points to the Great Seal of the United States, the one with the eagle and the pyramid.
Novus Ordo Seclorum.
Yeah, a new order for the ages.
It's like a declaration of ambition.
Oh, absolutely. It's like America saying, we're not just breaking from the past, we're actively building the future. And there's this really fascinating duality there.
How do you mean?
Well, on the one hand, you have this idealistic striving for a better world, a new era of, liberty and equality. But on the other hand, you also have this belief in technology, this idea that we can use technology to dominate nature and achieve progress. It's like two sides of the same coin.
So you have this nation built on reinvention, aiming for a new order. But how does that actually play out in history?
Well, that's where Friedman's theory of cycles comes in. He sees two big cycles that drive American history. One institutional, the other socioeconomic.
Right. The institutional cycle, it lasts about 80 years. And it really focuses on the relationship between the federal government and society. Like, how does the government function? What role does it play in people's lives?
Exactly. And you see these moments of massive upheaval. Things like the Civil War, the Great Depression. These are points where the relationship between the government and the people is completely reshaped.
So then what about the socioeconomic cycle?
So that one runs on a shorter track, about 50 years. And it's all about shifts in the economy, technology, social dynamics.
It's like a pendulum swinging back and forth.
Yeah, exactly. It swings between periods of stability and upheaval.
And with each swing, it finds a new equilibrium.
Right. And what's striking is how much faster and more dynamic these cycles are in America compared to other nations. It's like America's living history in fast forward. And that pace of change, it brings us to a pretty startling statistic. The U.S. has been at war for almost the entire 21st century so far.
Which seems to contradict our image as this peaceful nation, right?
It does. And Friedman argues that despite this, tension between peace and conflict, war has actually been a huge part of shaping American identity.
It's like this paradox, right? We have this deep belief in the American dream, this individual pursuit of happiness. But alongside that, there's this warrior ethos. This image of the American hero, the person who's willing to fight for what they believe in.
Absolutely. It's like the classic image of the cowboy, that rugged individualist, but he's also a skilled warrior. He defends his town from outlaws.
And alongside the cowboy, you have the self-made entrepreneur who's battling it out in the marketplace. Two very American heroes.
Exactly. Which actually brings us to another fascinating idea that Friedman explores, the United States as an unintentional empire.
Okay, now that's interesting. So here we have America, born from a rebellion against an empire, and it ends up becoming this global superpower.
Yeah, wielding immense influence through their economy, military, and culture.
But at the same time, there's this real discomfort with the label empire.
It's a paradox, because American influence isn't really about, conquering territory or exploiting resources in the traditional sense.
It's more about shaping global culture through their way of life, their values, and their technological dominance.
Exactly. Think about the impact of Hollywood movies, American music, or tech giants like Apple and Google. They have a global reach.
It's almost like America's impact is based more on attraction and assimilation than brute force.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
But like all empires throughout history, that kind of influence doesn't come without resentment.
Right. It creates this really complex dynamic where America is admired and resented, loved and feared all at the same time. People are drawn to its opportunities and culture, but they're also wary of its power.
For sure.
All right, so we've got these cycles, this unintentional empire, and this tension between peace and war, aspiration and resentment. Now, things get really interesting when Friedman talks about how the two key cycles, the institutional and the socioeconomic, are converging right now.
In the 2020s.
Right.
And that convergence is creating a lot of pressure on American society, potentially even leading to a major crisis.
It's like two tectonic plates colliding. It's bound to cause some tremors.
Yeah, like a perfect storm brewing. And in the middle of all of this, we see the rise of what Friedman calls technocracy.
So what exactly is technocracy?
Basically, it's the idea that experts, people with specialized knowledge, should be the ones making decisions and managing complex systems.
Okay, the data-driven, problem-solving elite. We see them everywhere these days. But Friedman argues that this approach, while it has its benefits, has also created a disconnect between those in power and the everyday experiences of most Americans.
Right, and he asks a really important question. Can this technocratic approach, with its reliance on data and expertise, truly address the deep social and political challenges of the 21st century? It's a question worth pondering.
It really is, and it's one we'll definitely be grappling with as we continue our deep dive. But before we move on, I want to touch on another key theme from Friedman's book, the rise and fall of small-town America.
Yeah, this is a fascinating one. It goes right to the heart of America's identity.
Right, small towns, I mean, they were once seen as the heartland of American values, right? They played a huge role in shaping the country's early history.
Oh, absolutely. There were centers of community, engines of economic growth. You know, those classic images of Main Street USA. It really captures that sense of small-town America.
The heart and soul of the nation.
But as America industrialized and urbanized, small towns found themselves at odds with the changing times. Their values started to clash with those of the rising industrial cities, and later with the more cosmopolitan values of the technocratic elite.
Friedman argues that this clash, this feeling of being left behind by progress, has contributed to the social and economic divides we see today.
Yeah, it's fueled resentment and alienation. People who feel forgotten or ignored by the forces of globalization and technological change.
And that sense of alienation has huge political implications.
Absolutely. We've seen that play out in recent years.
Right. And it's something we'll be exploring further in the next part of our deep dive. But for now, let's just take a pause and reflect on what we've uncovered so far. America, a nation built on reinvention, driven by powerful cycles, grappling with the complexities of global influence and internal divisions. It's a pretty complex picture.
It really is. A fascinating picture, but not always a pretty one. And things get even more complicated when you look at what's happening in small towns today.
You're talking about the decline of those traditional industries, the opioid crisis, automation.
Exactly. It's like the very foundation of their way of life is crumbling.
And you mentioned earlier that the sense of alienation has political implications. Does Friedman dig into that?
He does. He connects it directly to what he calls a crisis in education and the rise of the technocratic elite.
Okay, so we hear a lot these days about the rising cost of college, student loan debt. How does that fit into the big picture?
Well, think about it. Getting into a top university is it's like winning the lottery. It's the key to joining this technocratic elite, the people who really hold the reins of power in so many areas of our society.
But that ticket is getting more and more expensive.
Exactly. And for a lot of people, it's just completely out of reach. So it creates this system where access to power and influence is basically limited to those who can afford it.
And of course, that breeds resentment.
It does. And it creates this situation where the people making decisions are often totally detached from the realities of everyday life for most Americans.
Friedman even suggests this system, fueled by all that student loan debt, might actually be heading for a major crisis.
It does. In fact, he predicts a complete restructuring of universities, maybe even of the technocracy itself, in the coming decades.
Wow. That's a pretty bold prediction. But when you look at the trends, it's not hard to imagine things reaching a breaking point. So where do we go from there? Does Friedman offer any solutions, or is it all doom and gloom?
Well, actually, this is where things get really interesting. Friedman suggests that a new social and political coalition might emerge from all of this turmoil, one that could really shake things up.
Okay, color me intrigued. Tell me more.
He sees a potential alliance forming between two groups that you wouldn't necessarily expect to see together.
Okay.
On the one hand, you have the children of the industrial working class, those folks who've been left behind by the decline of manufacturing, And on the other hand, you have people who feel excluded by the technocratic system, the folks who maybe don't have the right credentials or social connections to make it in this new economy.
So two groups who've been sidelined by different forces, but who both feel like the system isn't working for them.
Exactly. And Friedman argues that this shared sense of alienation, this feeling of being marginalized by the existing power structures, it could actually be the spark that ignites a powerful populist movement.
It's interesting. It reminds me of other populist movements in American history, like the Jacksonian Democrats back in the 19th century. They challenged the power of the Eastern elites.
That's a great comparison. And Friedman sees a similar dynamic at play in the 21st century. He thinks this new coalition could reshape the political landscape in a big way. But it's not just internal forces that America has to deal with. Friedman also talks about some major demographic challenges on the horizon.
Right. Declining birth rates, increasing life expectancy. We hear a lot about how this is going to put a strain on things like Social Security and healthcare. What does Friedman have to say about all that?
He's pretty blunt. He calls it a demographic time bomb, an aging population that could lead to economic strain, a shrinking workforce. But he also suggests this challenge forces us to rethink our whole approach to aging and longevity.
So it's not just about figuring out how to fund Social Security for longer. It's about fundamentally changing how we view the later stages of life.
Exactly. Friedman says addressing this challenge requires a revolution in things like biological research and medical technology. We need breakthroughs in anti-aging regenerative medicine, things that can extend the healthy lifespan and allow people to be productive for longer.
It's almost like we need to rewrite what it means to age.
It's a big challenge.
Yeah.
And it could have huge implications for society as a whole. And of course, we can't talk about big challenges without talking about climate change. Where does Friedman stand on that issue?
That's a good question.
Well, he acknowledges the reality of climate change, the potential impact, but he's cautious about some of the more dire predictions.
Really?
He's a bit skeptical of those large-scale government interventions. He thinks technological innovation is more likely to be the answer.
So instead of focusing on things like drastically reducing carbon emissions, he's more interested in clean energy breakthroughs?
Yes. He specifically mentions the potential of space-based solar power.
Wow.
Harnessing energy from the sun in space and beaming it down to Earth. It's a bold idea. But it does highlight how important it is to invest in cutting-edge research and development, especially in fields like energy and space exploration.
It's like he's saying, don't just try to mitigate the damage. Go for a technological leap that could fundamentally change the game.
You got it. And despite all these challenges, all these storms on the horizon, Friedman's overall message is one of cautious optimism about America's future.
So even with all the upheaval and uncertainty, he still believes in America's ability to navigate these choppy waters.
He does. He emphasizes that the core values of liberty and obligation, those principles enshrined in the Constitution, they're going to continue to shape the nation's destiny. He reminds us that America has always been a nation of cycles, of crisis and renewal.
These periods of upheaval aren't signs of failure. They're opportunities for reinvention and adaptation.
Right. It's that classic American spirit of resilience and reinvention, the ability to weather the storms and come out stronger on the other side.
It's that ability to reinvent itself, to embrace change, to forge a new path forward. That's what makes America so unique.
Exactly.
It is inspiring to think that even with all these huge issues facing us, we can still shape the future. But I gotta admit, it can feel kind of overwhelming too, right? Like, where do we even start?
It's true. I mean, these challenges are massive. But Friedman gives us some clues. He says, step back from those day-to-day headlines.
Don't get lost in the weeds.
Exactly. Think about the bigger trends,
Wow.
the long game. It's like he's saying, ignore the noise, find the signal.
Okay, I like that. So we need to step back and ask the bigger questions, like, what should the government be doing to address these things? Or how can we use technology for good, not just for profit? Maybe even, what does it even mean to be American in the 21st century?
You got it. Friedman is pushing us to really think about these things, to have those tough conversations, even if they get a little uncomfortable, because that's how we learn.
Right. It's not just about taking in information. It's about engaging with ideas, forming our own opinions.
Absolutely. And that goes back to Friedman's point about cautious optimism. He believes that even with all these storms brewing, America has this incredible ability to adapt, to reinvent itself.
It's that resilience, that innovative spirit.
Yeah. He's basically saying, don't underestimate America. It's been through tough times before, and it's always come out stronger on the other side.
But he's not just talking about the country as a whole, right? He's talking about every single American playing a part in this renewal.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
He says we're not just watching history happen, we're making it.
Our choices matter.
They do. Every action, every decision shapes the world around us.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into George Friedman's The Storm Before the Calm, I want to leave you with this. What kind of future do you see for America in the coming decades? What role do you want to play in making that future happen? What can you do today to start building the world you want to see? History isn't just something that happens to us.
We're creating it
Yeah,
every single day.
that's a great way to put it. We're not passengers, we're the navigators. And the choices we make today, they chart the course for tomorrow. So embrace the challenge, keep thinking about these ideas, and don't ever stop believing in the power of possibility.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep shaping the future.